All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Kyle Anslone Show. We have a lot to talk about on today's show. In fact, my notes for today's show just kept evolving through the day as more and more news came in. It seems we may really be getting to interesting points, and I mean that in a good way when it comes to negotiating an end to the war in Ukraine. Now, I think it's a very different situation when it comes to Gaza, where we have this peace deal. It's we're getting through phase one of the deal, but what we're hearing from Trump, from Netanyahu, from the White House is not good signs on if we could get that deal to continue, bring a permanent end to the fighting and a rebuilding of Gaza for the Palestinians. So let's jump right into it. This first clip I have today is of Jake Tapper, and he's in an interview with Steve Witkoff. And so this is supposed to be a question, but as typical with the US mainstream media, it's really not a question. He's trying to vocalize his point of view. So let's hear what Tapper has to say.
I think everybody watching can understand the need for diplomacy, and especially President Trump wanting to reset the relationship with Russia. But what do you say to the millions of Americans and people around the world who are concerned that the United States right now doesn't seem to understand who actually launched this war against Ukraine and is actually trying to sidle up to the bad guys, Putin and the Russians, while screwing over the good guys, Zelensky and Ukraine? I think that is a fear that a lot of Americans have.
This question is absolutely crazy to me. I mean, in a way, I hate Jake Tapper, so I want to call him an idiot, but it's actually quite savvy what he does. Remember, in November, we had an election, and one of the difference when it came to Trump Biden or Trump Harris, the policy difference that they advocated was the war in Ukraine. And so when he says that I understand diplomacy, what he really does understand is that the American people in November voted for diplomacy, but he doesn't say that. In fact, the position that he combines with the viewpoint of the American people is that of they're afraid of diplomacy. They're afraid of talking to the Russians. They're afraid of, abandoning the Ukrainians. That's what he's trying to present to you. He completely shifts what's going on in such a really diabolical way that he's able to try to deceive the audience into thinking that the consensus viewpoint, what everyone really should believe, is to be afraid. And it's just, oh, there's this idea of diplomacy. No, what the American people want, Jake, what the American people voted for, what this all-important democracy that you uphold is supposed to do is, when the people vote for a leader, that leader is supposed to implement the policy that the people voted for. Well, that policy is diplomacy. And so he tries a very sneaky way to basically say this is against what the American people want. That's not the case. Now, worse, he goes on to frame this in such a juvenile way. Oh, you had the good guys who are these Ukrainians and the bad guys who are these Russians. And look, no war is ever that simple. Even in wars where you do have really nefarious actors, oftentimes the opposition in that war did have a large role, a large hand to play in the creation of that conflict, even if they end up being the victims, the losers of the war. Even if what happens to them is unfair, it doesn't mean that there weren't off-ramps. And of course, the people that suffer oftentimes are not the ones who ignored those off-ramps as their elected leaders. But, this is how Jake Tapper understands the world, is that the leaders represent the people. And so when he's saying that good guys versus bad guys, what he is saying is that in his worldview, there are these white hat Ukrainians, and they're the defenders of democracy. They're out there on the frontier of civilization. They have set up a respectable country. And then there's this mean, nasty new Hitler and Vladimir Putin who's trying to, expand the dark regions and take over this thriving hub of democracy. And of course, that was never true. Ukraine wasn't a thriving hub of democracy, and especially not compared to Russia. There is not particular liberal values in Ukraine. After the war broke out, Zelensky declared martial law. 18 to 50 to 60-year-old men not allowed to leave the country. General conscription for those 25 and older, all kinds of penalties for dissenting against the narrative, even people who posted online that they would prefer a negotiated end to the settlement were rounded up by Zelensky's goons. An American reporter who was in Ukraine was imprisoned by the police and killed through medical neglect. There's a nationalization of the media. There's a takeover. And, Zelensky has outlawed opposition parties. And of course, people say, oh, those are pro Russian parties. There's also parties that aren't pro-Russian, like the party of Petro Poroshenko was also sanctioned by the Zelensky government. And so the idea that this is some great democracy we're defending is just completely absurd. And then that the Russians are just the bad guys in this. Putin did invade Ukraine, and certainly that does not make him the hero of this conflict or just the victim. However, as we'll talk about, this war didn't happen in a vacuum. And before I move on, and because we have this white black narrative being painted here, it's very important to remember the truth behind this war. And while Jake Tapper would call this and just refer to this as essentially Russian propaganda, these are two articles from the Washington Post. So the first one is the headline: NATO says Ukraine to decide on peace deal with Russia with limits. And in this article, what the Washington Post reports is this leads to an awkward reality for NATO. For some in NATO, it's better for Ukraine to keep fighting and dying than to achieve a peace that comes too early or at too high a cost to Kiev and the rest of Europe. And so what they are saying there is that there was a deal on the table in April of 2022 that Ukraine could have taken and that Ukraine wanted to take to end the conflict. But instead of going down that path, what the Americans did is we sent Boris Johnson, the then UK Prime Minister, to Kiev to tell the Ukrainians, we are not going to back you if you take this deal with Russia. And why? Well, that's explained by David Ignatius in this article titled The Strategist in the Hurricane. And what he writes is, but a close advisor explained to me that Sullivan had made a twofold decision on Ukraine: keep supporting Ukraine to bolster its leverage and diminish Russia's fighting force and avoid escalation risk with Russia. It was a subtle, cold-blooded strategy for the United States. And advisory at low cost to America, with Ukraine paying the butcher's bill. That's how Sullivan would have described it. That's not how Sullivan would have described it, but that's how it was in the practical effect Kissinger would have approved. And so what they're saying there is that the Americans knew that they were never going to help the Ukrainians win this war, but they wanted to keep the Ukrainians fighting in this conflict. So we give them a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more, because we can't give them too much because that's going to provoke a direct war with Russia. At the same time, Russia is being weakened in this conflict. They're spending more money on their military. Their young men are they're dying in this conflict. They're sustaining lifelong injuries. All kinds of moral and emotional injuries are occurring to the Russians because of this war. We know from the Iraq war and all the war on terror that, you pay a blood price in your own society for going to war and ordering your young men to go off and fight and kill or die. This is going to hurt Russia, and the Americans understand that. Now, they also understood that whatever price that Russia is paying, whatever blood price Russia is paying, Ukraine is paying a far heavier price, and they were okay. They knew that, and they still moved forward with this policy. So, to answer Jake Tapper, no, this isn't some enlightened policy of a good side versus an evil side. In fact, maybe the most evil actor in all of this is NATO and the United States of America for not negotiating with Russia to end this war in the first place. So that was my answer to the question, but Steve Witkoff had one as well. That was also very interesting. So let's go ahead and play this next clip from Witkoff.
The war didn't need to happen. It was provoked. It doesn't necessarily mean it was provoked by the Russians. There were all kinds of conversations back then about Ukraine joining NATO. The president has spoken about this. That didn't need to happen. It basically became a threat to the Russians. And so we have to deal with that fact. And those are real facts on the ground here.
All right, so before I break down that clip, just want to say we got quite a few people listening live. That's really excellent. If you can, go ahead and repost it, get it out there to a few more people. If you're listening on YouTube, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. If you have any thoughts about what we're discussing, leave us a message, drop it in the live chat. Now, Witkoff saying this war is provoked, I think, is very important. This is something that has obviously been the case throughout the conflict. However, the NATO propaganda line, the Washington propaganda line has been this war is unprovoked, and anybody who disagrees is just repeating the Kremlin propaganda. But now we have an envoy. It seems now like Trump's main diplomatic envoy, Steve Witkoff, saying that no, this war was provoked. And what he's saying is that there were opportunities, there were off ramps. This could have been negotiated. And rather than negotiating, the West refused to do that. They kept Ukraine in this limbo position where, in one sense, Joe Biden told Zelensky behind the scenes, they admitted it behind the scenes that Ukraine would never join NATO. However, publicly, they would not state that. And to make matters worse, they were treating Ukraine as a de facto member of the alliance. They were sending Ukraine more weapons. They were conducting NATO military war games in Ukraine. We had a British warship move within 12 nautical miles of the Crimean Peninsula to challenge Russia's territorial claim there. These were major provocations at Russia, that steps that did not need to be taken, but they were. And rather than negotiating to try to de-escalate the situation, the Biden administration, we openly have Biden administration advisors who have said, we didn't take the Russians seriously when they said they didn't want Ukraine in NATO. We didn't think that was a serious demand of theirs. And so we didn't negotiate on that issue. They refused to negotiate on the core issues, and that's what led to this conflict. So I have one more clip of Witkoff's response here that I also thought was very interesting. Let's go ahead and play.
But be that as it may, the Russians have indicated that they are responsive to an end to this. There were very, very what I'll call cogent and substantive negotiations framed in something that's called the Istanbul Protocol Agreement. We came very, very close to signing something, and I think we'll be using that framework as a guidepost to get a peace deal done between Ukraine and Russia, and I think that will be an amazing day. And the fact is, the president understands how to get deals done. Deals only work, Jake, when they're good for all the parties, and that's the pathway that we're on here.
So there's a few important things here. One, acknowledging that a deal has to work for all parties is important, but this is something that the Biden administration refused to recognize, that the U.S. mainstream media refuses to recognize. They say that the deal basically has to be 100% concessions from Russia and none from the United States. I think in their mind, after the Russian forces give up Ukraine and go home, they're supposed to also keep all the sanctions on the Russian and never lift the economic war against them as well, essentially make this conflict go on and on and on. And one of the other problem, or one of the really interesting things that Witkoff says there, is that the negotiation is going to be negotiated according to the Istanbul Accords. And this was something, again, that happened in 2022 when the Russians first invaded Ukraine. They offered to withdraw to the pre-invasion lines. And so this would have meant that the only portion of Ukraine that Russia would have taken from their post 1990, after the Soviet Union dissolved, those 1991 borders of Ukraine, was the Crimean Peninsula, which Russia annexed in 2014, and the people of Crimea voted for. It's pretty clear that Crimea rather be a part of Russia than a part of Ukraine that was actively anti-Russia. And so that vote happened, and that's the way that was. However, Russia was even willing to go back to allowing the Donbass to be an autonomous region of Ukraine rather than a region of Russia. However, after those negotiations were rejected, and again, this was rejected by Ukraine, but at the urging of the West, at the urging of Joe Biden and Boris Johnson, who promised Zelensky, they said, we will give you whatever it takes for as long as it takes. Of course, that was a lie. Nobody talks about that. Everybody's blasting Donald Trump for not being a good ally to the Ukrainians. But Washington and London were actively lying to Zelensky and the Ukrainian people every time they said that. They never gave the Ukrainians what it took. It was never going to be for as long as it takes. They're willing to give the Ukrainians enough weaponry so that they didn't lose the war. That was the point, to keep the Russians fighting in Ukraine, not to help the Ukrainians win that conflict. And so this is just a really disgusting policy, and that we're going to go back to the framework of the Istanbul Accords. Now, Russia has made it pretty clear that there's 4 regions of Ukraine now, the Donbass republics of Donetsk and Luhansk, as well as the 2 southern oblasts of Zaporizhia and Kherson, that they have annexed and that they are not going to give back to Ukraine. My guess is that Russia certainly is not going to give back any of the territory that they currently control in those 2 regions. However, they don't control 100% of all 4 of those regions. In fact, I believe with Donetsk and Zaporizhia, it's actually around 2/3 of that territory that they actually control. And so there may be room now, if we enter into negotiations, to try to secure as much of Ukraine's territory as possible. And so that is something that the United States could do if we entered into these negotiations in a serious way. But rather than what the mainstream media wants is for us to just keep fighting this conflict. Now we'll see what Trump is actually negotiating here. What's going on. There's a lot of focus on this mineral deal that Trump really wants Ukraine to sign, and Russia seems to see an opportunity here, because a lot of Ukraine's mineral wealth is actually in the Donbass republics, and is in territory that is now held by Russia. And so Putin is saying that, we could export some of this to the United States and do a deal with the United States on some of this mineral wealth as well. But it really seems like Zelensky is misunderstanding Donald Trump at this point, attacking Donald Trump publicly, and that could end up costing Ukraine quite a bit at the final negotiating table. Now, my hope is that the U.S. is going to try to negotiate the best deal possible for Ukraine. I think that if we did that, we could actually create a more stable security environment overall in Europe. Agree not to conduct war games on each other's border, not to conduct these provocative flights where we take our nuclear capable bombers and fly those near the Russian border, or Russia does that to American borders. Remove missile bases from Poland and Romania that are seen as highly problematic by Russia. So there are plenty of steps that we could take that would be concessions on our end. Opening up economically to Russia is another major one, that Russia may also be willing to make concessions when it comes to Ukraine and give them back more territory. Now, is Trump capable of negotiating in that way? I sure hope so. We'll see what's going to happen, but Trump is making very interesting statements on the negotiations, and that they could be moving very quickly in the next few weeks. So this is Trump today speaking with the French president, and let's hear what Trump has to say.
I think the war could end soon.
Well, how soon?
Within weeks.
Weeks?
Yeah, I think so. Right? Don't you think so? I'd like to have you. I think we could end it within weeks if we're smart. If we're not smart, it'll keep going, and we'll keep losing young, beautiful people that shouldn't be dying. And we don't want that. And remember what I said. This could escalate into a third world war. And we don't want that either.
Trump makes 2 really good points here, and it's absolutely insane that he's being attacked for this policy when he keeps saying we don't want to get into a third world war. We want to get along with Russia. This is really important. The U.S. and Russia are the 2 world's largest nuclear superpowers, and so us having a relationship where at least there's communication, understanding on the nuclear issue, some arms control agreements, is really important for the survival of the entire planet. Now, the other point Trump makes, and he's made it a lot. He keeps saying it time and time again. There are so many people, so many young people dying in this conflict that don't need to die. And so many of these people are Ukrainians. While there's all this US propaganda that most of the people dying in this conflict are Russians, I think if we actually understand what's going on, it's probably far more Ukrainians, given how much more artillery Russia is able to fire, how much more manpower that they have versus the Ukrainians, and that the Ukrainians have been on the back foot on the retreat for some time. Seems to suggest that the Ukrainians are not doing well. I saw a clip from Amy Klobuchar, Senator Klobuchar, where she is going on about how we need to keep this war going and how we can't negotiate an end to the war, and just casually mentions that there's 1,000 Ukrainian casualties a day. Now that this war, which today is on its third anniversary, is over 1,000 days old, if that average holds up, that's 1 million Ukrainian casualties throughout this conflict. These are massive numbers of young people dying, and anybody who supports Ukraine, who is concerned about Ukraine, should be really concerned about the Ukrainian casualties. But again, there's just none of that concern, and all the attacks on Trump are criticizing him for wanting to bring this war to a close. So I hope he's serious about the end of this war potentially being just a few weeks away. Certainly, my guess is it starts off with a temporary ceasefire and then moves into a more permanent one. But the fact that Wickoff is talking about the Istanbul talks and moving back to that kind of framework, I think is fairly optimistic, because remember, just a few years ago, Ukraine was willing to agree to that deal. They've lost some territory since, but bringing this war to a close is really important, and maybe Zelensky will agree to it. Now let's move over to the Middle East, where, as good as the remarks that Wickoff and Trump have on that ending that conflict are in Ukraine, the situation is not the same in Gaza. So let's go ahead and play this next clip from Wickoff.
You met with Ron Dermer, the former ambassador from Israel to the United States and a close confidant of Prime Minister Netanyahu. Do you believe that Netanyahu wants to move forward with the ceasefire, or does he want to resume the war to try to eliminate Hamas?
I believe the Prime Minister is well motivated. He wants to see hostages released, that's for sure. He also wants to protect the state of Israel, and so he's got a red line, and he said what the red line is, and that is that Hamas cannot be involved in a governing body when this thing is resolved. And so I think he's trying to square the circle on both of those things. But we've talked extensively, Ron and I, the Prime Minister, and everybody is focused on bringing people home alive.
So is the red line Hamas can't be part of any governance of Gaza, or is the red line Hamas can't exist?
You know, I would say at this point, for sure, they can't be any part of governance in Gaza. And, you know, as to existing, I'd leave that detail to the Prime Minister.
So I thought this clip was so interesting because it's part of the same interview with Jay Tapper, and he does Wickoff does a similar thing on Meet the Press, I believe, where he talks about Ukraine and then Gaza. And on Ukraine, the Trump administration is telling Zelensky that the Ukrainians have to make a deal, that we are going to talk to the Russians directly, and that we are going to make a deal here. Where when it comes to Israel, we say Netanyahu gets to set the red lines. Netanyahu gets to dictate this agreement. Where's the concern about America first now when it comes to the Middle East and Israel? Obviously, it's the best if the United States spends less money in the Middle East, if we commit less military assets to the Middle East, if we're able to unwind the conflicts, and Trump could be the great peacemaker that he wants to be. Well, if he wants to do that, then the U.S. is going to have to get tough with Benjamin Netanyahu. And it's just very interesting how Netanyahu and the Israelis are just told that they're going to get everything they want, when the Trump administration is willing to put the Ukrainians in a position where they have to be realistic, where they have to bring this war to an end. So now let's hear what Wickoff says is going to happen with phase one moving into phase two of the ceasefire deal.
Hamas freed 6 hostages yesterday, and they turned over the body of Shiri Bibas, that's the Israeli mother, who was kidnapped with her 2 children on October 7th and killed in custody by Hamas, according to the Israeli government. Israel is right now delaying the release of 620 Palestinian prisoners, quote, until the release of the next hostages has been assured and without the humiliating ceremonies, unquote, Hamas has been staging. What does this all mean for phase 2 of the ceasefire? Do you expect phase 2 to go forward?
We do expect it, Jake, to go forward. We have to get an extension of phase 1, and so I'll be going into the region this week, probably Wednesday, to negotiate that.
So first off, once again, we just have to note on how loaded Jay Tapper's question is here. He's not trying to ask a fair and a balanced question. He's trying to get his listeners to understand that Hamas is bad. Hamas is evil. Hamas is violating the ceasefire deal, when in reality, it's the Israelis, as he even said, that are violating the ceasefire deal. So what he's referring to is that Hamas has been holding these ceremonies when they release Israeli hostages, where they pull them up on stage, they give them a little plaque. At times, the Israelis hostages have seemed pretty receptive and like kind of happy to be involved in the ceremony, where they look like they're shaking hands or thanking the Hamas who held them captive. And certainly this is kind of an ugly thing to do. These are essentially prisoners of war, and to have these lavish ceremonies to hand them over is rather ridiculous. At the same time, all the Palestinian hostages that are being released by Israel have been subject to beatings, have been subject to torture in the days before their release. Their families have been harassed and their homes have been raided. And while Israel has had major celebrations once they've gotten the hostages returned, Israel actually bars the Palestinians from doing the same. And so I think it's highly problematic to just frame what Hamas is doing with the hostage release, their propaganda, as a ceasefire violation, but not what Israel is doing. More blatantly, Israel has violated this ceasefire time and time again. I wrote an article about this that was published at the Libertarian Institute yesterday. And one of the things I note in that article is that Israel has killed over 100 Palestinians since the ceasefire took place. Hundreds of shots fired, dozens of airstrikes. And so there's been 200 and something Israeli violations of bombing and shooting Palestinians, over 100 killed again, over 200 injured by these repeated Israeli ceasefire violations. That's, multiple ceasefire violations every single day by Israeli forces. On top of that, Israel was supposed to allow in 60,000 mobile homes, 200,000 tents, and construction equipment to begin clearing debris. And Netanyahu has refused to allow any of that in. Additionally, 800 trucks of aid was supposed to be allowed in every single day, and Israel has not been hitting that goal. And so all of these are clear ceasefire violations that Israel is just continuing to violate with no accountability in the American press. Now, Hamas has actually moved ahead of the agreement. And last week they released 6 living Israeli hostages in it, instead of doing it 3 one week and 3 the next week, as originally outlined in the agreement. The 3 that were to be released this coming Saturday were supposed to be the 3 hostages that were released during the final week of phase 1 of the ceasefire agreement. Now, the really important thing that Witkoff says to Tapper is that we're going to expand phase 1 of the agreement. Now, the reason that Israel and the United States want to do this is because Netanyahu is trying to get all the hostages out of Gaza without agreeing to a permanent ceasefire, without allowing significant aid to re-enter Gaza, and without a complete Israeli withdrawal from the Strip or the beginning of rebuilding Gaza for the Palestinians. And all that is going to happen in phase 2 and phase 3 of the hostage and ceasefire agreement. And so by extending phase 1, what they're going to do is get Hamas to release more and more hostages without Israel ever holding up to any of its agreements that they were supposed to implement, not only just in phase 1, but also in phase 2 and 3. And so this is all about getting Israel everything they want without getting Hamas anything. And of course, Hamas represents the Palestinian side, and this is really about ethnically cleansing the Gaza Strip. Now, I have one more clip here from Witkoff, and I think this one is going to be the ultimate deal breaker that causes the ceasefire to collapse.
The White House press secretary Caroline Leavitt told reporters yesterday that President Trump feels, quote, very strongly that
So in that second phase, talking about what comes next for Gaza becomes part of that. For that day after, do Hamas leaders need to leave Gaza? Are you discussing that? And if so, where would they go?
So, Margaret, the May 27th protocol agreement signed last May 27th sets forth that the Phase 2 negotiation is much about two things. A permanent ceasefire, a cessation of all violence, and in addition to that, the fact that Hamas cannot be allowed to come back into the government. Mm-hmm. And I think the way you square that circle is that Hamas has to go. They've got to leave. And we're
physically.
the negotiation will be around that. I would say physically, that's correct.
Where would they go? Has any country offered to take them in?
Well, I think the devil is in the details, and we've had a lot of discussions around it. I'm not at liberty to have that specific discussion today, but we've got some ideas, and that will be part of the negotiation.
So one of the things that was stated when Hamas originally agreed to this deal that took effect on January 19th was that they weren't going to sign on to an agreement that ultimately saw their elimination and their complete removal. Now, it did appear that Hamas was willing to take at least a bad seat or maybe no rule at all when it came to the civilian governance of Gaza, but that they were still going to exist in Gaza as a resistance group post this deal being completed. But what Witkoff is saying right there is that that's not going to be allowed, that Hamas must leave Gaza. Now, of course, there's two huge questions there. One of those Margaret Brennan does ask, which is where are they going to go? Who's going to take them in? But the bigger question is how is that going to happen? One of the things that Witkoff said previously in that interview was Gaza is littered with unexploded ordinances. And he is saying this as, oh, we need to get the people out to keep them safe. But the real reason those unexploded ordinances are such a problem is, partly for the Palestinian people. I'm sure there are going to be children, and others who are killed when they're moving debris from their house and an additional bomb goes off. However, Hamas knows how to reprocess and repurpose these Israeli munitions. And so what's going to happen is that Hamas is going to take these bombs. They're going to take these artillery shells. They're going to turn them into rockets and anti-tank weapons. And they're going to use that to attack the Israelis. And so the idea that Israel is now going to be able to just clean Gaza out of Hamas is simply ridiculous. Hamas is going to be able to fight back. They have significant armaments. And if the United States expects Hamas to just agree to drop their guns and leave Gaza, it's simply a fantasy. And I think this fantasy is really aimed at setting conditions for Hamas that may seem reasonable to American observers who don't understand, who just learned a little bit about this from Jay Tapper on the Sunday morning shows. But in reality, they're setting poison pills into the agreement. That way, one day, Hamas breaks the deal. All right, everyone. I really appreciate you all tuning in to the Kyle Anzalone Show today. Well over 100 people listening live. If those of you on X could head on over to the YouTube channel and subscribe, that will help us out. Additionally, for those of you listening on YouTube, go ahead and leave us a comment. Tell us what you thought of today's show, what we could do differently for next time, maybe something else you want to hear me talk about. Really appreciate you all tuning in. We'll be back with another episode soon.